What impact will industry consolidation and technology have on the wireless workforce? Stay tuned as we talk to Martha DeGrasse, who recently published a report on trends in wireless infrastructure. Thank you.
Nexius, accelerating network and business transformation.
Telecom Careers, the #1 global telecom and wireless job board. telecomcareers.com.
Welcome to another episode of Inside Telecom Careers. Today we're going to focus on consolidation on the industry as well as technology changes. We have Martha DeGrasse, who recently published a report on wireless infrastructure trends. Martha, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
Well, before we dive into the report, let's kind of recap some of this week's big news. First of all, it's a big week for devices. We'll talk about some of those things. Number two, CommScope is continuing their acquisition spree with buying Irvana on the heels of acquiring TE Connectivity. Nokia announced the launch of a gigabit small cell radio. And then finally last week, Sprint announced investing another $150 million in the Chicago market with plans to hire another 1,000 people. But let's talk a minute about some of these device stories this week. We can't go a week without talking about Apple, but there were rumors last week that Samsung was going to be laying off over 10,000 people. They have since denied that rumor and said they're just going to be doing a hiring freeze. Apple and Samsung launched new devices. HTC was delisted from the Taiwan Stock Exchange. What do you make? And I forgot to mention, BlackBerry also acquired Good Technologies, which is a mobile device management company, and I think for over $400 million. So
Right.
What's happening? What do you think in devices?
Well, yeah, the BlackBerry, I don't see that so much as about devices. I think that's more about, getting BlackBerry to be able to offer mobile security solutions outside of the BlackBerry, ecosystem. Now they can offer Android. So I think that'll be great for them. But getting to the devices, I think it's great news that Samsung isn't laying people off. It's certainly, they can afford to hold on in the device area much longer, for example, than HTC can or some of those smaller Android competitors. So, I'm not surprised that they're going to stick it out, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with their new device. Certainly, they have been losing market share to Apple over the past year, and Apple's got the new iPhone 6s. I think the most interesting thing about the iPhone launch is the leasing option. Yeah. They're making that iPhone as affordable, really, as an Android for most people.
That's interesting. There have been stories written this week about Apple taking on the carriers in terms of really wresting control of the customer by offering the phone leasing directly. So again, it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic plays out, because if a customer can pay the same amount for the phone from Apple directly as they can from the carrier, who are they going to go to? So time will tell.
In some ways, the carriers love it. I mean, one of the biggest tweeters of that news was Marcelo Claury, So I think that, anything that gets people upgrading their devices more, coming into the store more, is good news for the carriers.
Well, at the PCIe Wireless Infrastructure show earlier this week, there was an analyst there talking about the drag on earnings and cash flow of the device subsidies, and talked a lot about the revenue recognition associated with those rental agreements or leasing agreements. So I think we should stay tuned and watch the impact on Apple's balance sheet of financing the phones, and then keep an eye on the carrier balance sheets to see what it means.
The carrier balance sheets, yeah. I mean, I think Apple's balance sheet is a little bit stronger, but yeah, all of them are interesting.
I read an interesting story this morning on a review about the new iPhone tablet. It has a pencil in it. Stylus. Well, they called it a pencil. Okay. And Steve Jobs, 6-7 years ago, hated the concept of a stylus. He said that it really should be about the user experience and being able to touch the phone and the iPad, et cetera. So it's a little bit interesting that the Apple devices now have a stylus attached to them. The writer of the story talked about the big difference between then and now is the fact that the screen, it's just a completely different experience, and you can start using an iPad for more work situations. And so where a stylus comes in handy, particularly the way they design the stylus with near or no latency.
Right. Well, again, they're kind of following Samsung's lead. Samsung went to the bigger screens.
True.
Apple went to the bigger screens. Samsung had a stylus a couple years ago. Now Apple does. And they do need to, get into the workplace. They're making these deals with Cisco, with IBM, but now they need to have the devices that are ready for the workplace as well,
Yep. One more story about the Amazon announced they were going to kill their Fire device.
Did they announce it, or did they just quietly stop selling it? I don't know.
Maybe so. And then they're coming out with a $50 kind of trimmed down tablet. So, and they announced that I guess some of the R&D folks at Amazon weren't too happy about kind of switching gears within the device division. So stay tuned. But let's move on to the CommScope acquisition of Airvana and talk a little bit about the Nokia acquisition or announcement of the gigabit small cell radio. What do you make of those announcements?
Well, they're all good news for small cells. I think that a lot of these infrastructure players are looking at ways to try to make small cells work for carriers, because for years we've been hearing that small cells are going to take off any minute, and it just hasn't happened. And it's because of the the different expenses, not just the equipment, but also the backhaul, the power, et cetera. So, getting back to what you asked about, Airvana is a really smart acquisition for CommScope, because it's a less expensive alternative usually for a venue than a distributed antenna system. So now CommScope has a new tool in its toolkit that it can offer to some of these venues and to the carriers that might be bringing connectivity to these venues. Mm-hmm. And then
how about the Nokia radio?
To me, what was the most interesting about that was the 3 RF slots. They were saying that carriers can use it for 3 LTE bands, carrier aggregation, or they could use it for LTE in unlicensed spectrum, and Wi-Fi. So they're really hedging their bets, because nobody knows exactly how things are going to play out as far as whether the unlicensed spectrum is going to be used, more for LTE or not, how carrier aggregation is going to play out. But Nokia is kind of ready for whatever with this small cell.
Well, it looks like Chicago is going to be the test bed of a lot of these new technologies. As you mentioned, SAC Wireless, which Nokia acquired, is headquartered there. Folks, if you missed our Inside Telecom edition a couple weeks ago, we interviewed Don Bach, who is Vice President of Engineering and Operations for SAC Wireless. So he talked about their engine room, which is now branded Nokia Engine Room. Check that video out. And then next week on this show, we're actually going to have Tracy Nolan, who is Sprint's president of the Midwest region. So she's going to tell us about where that money is going to go, what types of technologies they're going to be testing and deploying. And they're also going to be talking about some of the new hires they're going to be making around the retail stores, field techs, and engineering. But you mentioned the engine room. What do you know about it? Is it a room? Is it does it fly? What is it?
It took me a long time too. It's not a room. It's actually a database now for Nokia. It's a database that carriers can use to look at those possible places that they might want to deploy a small cell, and they can evaluate the leasing cost, the availability of power, the availability of fiber for backhaul, and of course the RF specs. So it's all there, and they can assign a site value index. So it really is meant to make it all a little bit more affordable for the carriers.
Well, one more announcement this week out of CTI. Ericsson made an acquisition around video compression and
encoding,
and that's a nice segue into the content business. And I'm going to take a little bit of a leap into the cable industry here because they are in the content distribution and creation business. The cable industry recently came out with a report, and guys, if we could pull up that asset on the cable industry report, it's all about the economic impact the cable industry is having on jobs. We've got the second slide that shows that $384 billion has been invested by the cable companies since 1992. 2.7 million jobs exist in the cable industry, and they've added 1.2 million in the last 13 years. So, the cable industry they've got their toe in the wireless space. They've got tens of thousands of Wi-Fi hotspots. We've got one from Time Warner Cable right outside our door here. Every time I come in the office, I open up my browser, and they're wanting me to join that hotspot. So, they're a threat there in terms of content distribution, content anywhere. You look at AT&T now integrating DirecTV and coming up with new bundles. So, what do you make of kind of the cable company and how they're? And by the way, we got a third slide. Let me pull up the third slide on the cable industry. They say they offer 100 million people across 50 states 30 megabits per second of service, which is kind of interesting given that the wireless industry and mobile industry is now talking about theoretical speeds of a gig on a mobile phone. So Where do you see the cable industry shaking out here in the wireless world?
You know, from a workforce perspective, I think that it all kind of converges because, you know, like you say, the cable industry is hitting Wi-Fi really, really hard. They're looking for those IT skill sets, and the wireless industry, you know, sort of the same. When they talk about these small cells, they're looking for people with these IT-related skill sets that can actually go into the buildings and pull cable, not, you know, and so for workforce issues, I think that, yeah, there's competition, but if you're able to offer these IT skill sets to these companies, I think you're in good shape.
Yeah, we had lunch with some of the HR folks from Time Warner Cable here in Austin, and they're planning to hire 60 field techs by the end of the year. So again, they're pushing deeper into their network with fiber and then pushing into Wi-Fi routers. So that's exactly the same skill that you're seeing AT&T and some of the carriers need. And go back to SAC Wireless. If they're deploying these networks, turnkey solutions that include site acquisition, installation, and acceptance, architecture, they need a lot of the same types of people. So you got the cable industry, mobile industry, that are both can be competing for the same type of field resources.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking this summer with Ericsson, and Greg Rogers is a great person to talk to at Ericsson, and he spends a lot of time thinking about workforce issues, and he said, really, you know, the RF skill sets are as important as ever. We still need those RF skill sets to design the networks on the front end and to optimize them at the end. But in the middle, we need those IT skill sets to actually install those networks in building.
Got it. Well, let's jump into your Wireless Infrastructure Service Company report. We've got a slide. It's a great looking report on the outside, but tell us a little bit about what's on the inside. What are some of the key takeaways, maybe starting with, you mentioned earlier this on the show that this year wasn't a particularly great year for the infrastructure service companies. So what do you mean by that?
I think things are starting to look up. Just in the month or so since we published this report, we're beginning to hear more about hiring. But 2015 was not the best year. It's you know, sort of one of those situations where carrier spending really had an impact, and certainly the wireless infrastructure companies rely on all the carriers, but Verizon and AT&T are the two biggest spenders, and AT&T is a more cyclical spender than Verizon. So when AT&T is at the top of a wave, as it was in 2014, the first half, it's great news for a lot of people. And then when AT&T sneezes, a lot of other companies catch pneumonia, a lot of smaller companies. So we did see a lot of pain in the industry during late 2014, early 2015. Some of the smaller players were actually acquired by bigger companies, as they may not have had the financial resources to weather a slowdown, really. But things are improving now. We're hearing more reports about hiring. But it was hard in the beginning of 2015 because at the same time that you had AT&T, you know, focusing more on its DirecTV acquisition and its Mexico acquisitions, you also had towers consolidating. AT&T had already sold its towers to Crown, and then Verizon sold its towers to American Tower. So a lot of these companies that had previously supported AT&T and Verizon for their tower businesses, they didn't really have as much work to do, and they didn't need as many people anymore because Crown and American Tower had their own resources that they used, you know. And then again, when you had these smaller infrastructure service providers being purchased by some of the bigger ones, that can also lead to a little bit of headcount reduction.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So in 2013, 2014, you had the big four carriers deploying their LTE.
Right.
Those massive builds were kind of tapering off and being completed. 2015, we expected to see a lot of small cell, but didn't. AT&T had announced doing a lot of small cell, but you're right, they got distracted with the DirecTV acquisition, the Mexico acquisition. But I think if we're reading the tea leaves right, 2016 could be the year for more massive small cell type deployments. It seems like the economics are getting better, not only in terms of the way they design, build, and operate small cell networks. The technology is better. Just the methodologies by which they can acquire those sites and operate those sites are better. The other thing goes back to devices at the start of the show. If they're not having to subsidize devices, that also frees up cash to be reallocated more to their network densification.
That's a great point. And you know, they've freed up cash by selling their towers as well. And it does. It all goes back to investing in the network because they have already spent billions on spectrum. They need to deploy it. So.
Yeah. Well, secondly, on a positive note, the industry truly responded to a lot of the tower deaths that we saw in 2013 and 2014, and I think that was caused largely by just the sheer number of deployments.
Yeah.
Required new people coming in
Yeah.
that weren't properly trained, and unfortunately we saw a real peak in tower climber fatalities. This year you saw PCIe come back strong and NATE come back strong with safety programs. What can you share with us about whether or not those programs are having an impact?
I think they're definitely having an impact. You know, this summer, as you know, the Texas State Wireless Association met here at RCR Studios. First thing they did before they started their party was have a safety meeting. So I thought that was very telling. And beyond just the focus on safety, I think that there are some actual changes taking hold from a technical perspective that are making a difference. Specifically, field software is out there to document safety auditors, safety procedures. And, you know, the cell towers enable smartphones. Well, the techs have their smartphones, and
Yep.
they can send in a report on their safety procedure before they climb the tower. So that's
Yeah.
a big difference, because before, I think that there was, you know, an opportunity to speed things up by getting the work done and then filing the report. So if you were going to say, oh, well, we really don't have everything we need from a safety equipment perspective, we really don't have all our hard hats, whatever. Well, it doesn't matter that you're reporting that after the climb. Hopefully everything went okay, but if it didn't, it's too late. But if you have to report that before the climb, if that has to be sent in beforehand, which it is now with more mobile technology, and I'm not saying that's everywhere, but we are starting to hear about that. So I think that's going to make a really big difference.
Yeah, that's a great point. It does go back to your earlier comment about the economics of deploying networks is just fundamentally getting better, and they have to be better in order for companies to invest in network densification. You know, 2013, 2014, when there was a mad rush to deploy LTE and cover as many POPs as possible, I would hear stories in Canada and the US where companies were hired, system integrators were hired to go do a deployment, and then when the operations side of a carrier would try to accept the network, they do the test and turn up of the actual acceptance of the networks weren't performing. And so they'd have to turn around and send crews back to the site, and this whole notion of a tiger team, two-man team to go back to a tower for a day to fix issues that weren't done properly the first time. So as the carriers look at small cell deployments, where you have tens of thousands of sites in a market, you simply can't afford to go back and do it twice or three times. You have to get it right the first time. So to your point about which light post has the best ROI, yeah, how much is it truly going to cost to get the electric there, get the power there, to mount the radio there, in terms of servicing the customers and impacting ARPU and churn in that city block. So Chicago is going to be an interesting test case to see, are the economics right? And then you may see more widespread deployments, but field software could have an impact coupled with the design software to make sure you got the site right the first time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Chicago, San Francisco, New York, and Boston are the markets to watch this year. Verizon's already well underway in San Francisco, getting ready for the Super Bowl. And then Verizon's also spoken about New York and Boston as two markets where they didn't acquire the spectrum they wanted in the most recent auction, and they're going to densify their networks instead with small cells.
Yeah, that's another good point. You talk about Chicago. Sprint, by way of the Clearwire acquisition, picked up a lot of 2.5 spectrum. And we haven't seen any massive deployments of the 2.5 spectrum. It's out there. The propagation is not as great, but for going through walls and long distances, but it could work very well to fit into the caverns between high-rise buildings.
Yeah.
I think it was either AT&T or Verizon announced that they're going to start using their AWS 2.3 spectrum. There again, the propagation is very similar to the 2.5 spectrum. Could be very good for backhaul or the front haul of a network. Do you have any insight on kind of the 2.3, 2.5 spectrum?
No, not really, but we do hear a lot about testing in those higher frequencies. You know, National Instruments is here in
Yeah.
town. They talk to us a lot about that. So I think that all argues in favor of small cells, because those really do leverage those higher frequencies.
Well, speaking of small cell, your report talked about small cell and DAS deployments. Are the same companies that build the towers being hired to deploy these new technologies?
They hope to be, yes. And in many cases they are, SAC Wireless being a great example. Again, it's about those skill sets. If all you can offer is tower climbers, then you might not get, a DAS job. So it's really about those in-building technicians, those IT skill sets, Ethernet, and of course fiber as well. But really having those individuals that are able to work indoors is key for these companies if they want to stay relevant with the move to densify networks.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Ethernet. Sean Kinney, our managing editor, is going to be interviewing the father, Bob Metcalf, of the inventor of the Ethernet. He's going to be here in our speaker lounge on the 21st. Folks
Fantastic.
can tune in live and watch the live stream, or you can come by the studio and watch it in person. We're going to have lunch here for folks, but it's I think noon on Monday
21st.
the 21st. So please tune in for Bob Metcalf. Thanks for that Ethernet plug. One of the slides that caught my attention in your report, and if you can bring up that slide that talks about the growth of macro towers and now the growth of cell sites, but maybe start by explaining the difference between towers and sites.
Well, you do see those diverging according to analyst projections in the years ahead. And a cell site can be a rooftop, or it can be a light post, or it can be even on like piece of street furniture, a park bench, any place that there's enough, not too much interference, and that the carriers feel that they can get the power in the backhaul, which is always sometimes actually that's a big unknown. And we do hear a lot about carriers identifying what they think is a perfect site only to get there and find out that they have to trench, or that there's a gas pipeline there, or there's a traffic light there, or there's something else, and suddenly their costs are skyrocketing, or maybe they're just abandoning the whole project. So we hear about that, but less and less, because I think that the companies that are really, really eager to sell small cells to the carriers are learning that they have to, facilitate the whole process by helping carriers gather the information they need.
Mm-hmm. So, Martha, you've been with RCR a number of years now. You've written this infrastructure report a couple different times. What are the big ahas for you as you revisited infrastructure service companies this year? What kind of summarized for our viewers what stood out in your mind?
It's becoming a much more professionalized industry. It is and remains a really entrepreneurial industry. I don't think that's going away, but the very small companies are finding opportunities to get together with bigger players, and that is leading to more professionalization. So the companies are more likely to be able to have access to something like a training tower, or to have access to standardized training. As you know, PCIA is really pushing this standardized training for the wireless workforce. So, the larger companies are more likely to be plugged into that. So that, to me, was what stood out the most this year.
Good. Well, folks, you can download the report by visiting RCR Wireless News. Look for the Reports tab at the top of the page. Here's a picture of what the report looks like. Also, if we could show the supplier guide in the back, I think there's a 40-page supplier guide that tracks all the service companies in the industry.
Great
so if you're
resource,
looking for service companies in different regions of the country, check out the supplier guide. And Martha, thank you so much for joining us this week. Join us next week. Again, same time, same channel, Thursday, 10 o'clock Central Time. We're going to have Tracy Nolan, who's president of Sprint's Midwest region. She's going to be talking specifically about the $150 million investment that they're making in Chicago. She's going to be talking about small cell DAS and hiring. Martha, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Inside Telecom Careers is a production of RCR TV News.
All right.
To reach Jeff Mucci or to suggest a show topic for Inside Telecom Careers, you can reach him at jmucci@rcrwireless.com. For all telecom-related news and information, please visit rcrwireless.com. To connect with the industry's top talent, please visit telecomcareers.net.